Alright, it's time to compare some early arcade ports to the Atari 2600 and see which game comes out on top. Believe it or not, there are many arcade to 2600 conversions that are better than the arcade, so let's see if we can find some, starting with Air Sea Battle. Now, Air Sea Battle for the 2600 is actually a combined game of 3 or 4 different arcade games: Anti-Aircraft, Drop Zone 4, and Seawolf. As you can see here, this is Anti-Aircraft, and this one is very difficult to emulate, so I've borrowed a little bit of footage from the actual arcade machine. And the graphics are extremely basic, the sound effects are slightly annoying, and it's also extremely difficult to hit those planes up there. They're very small. Well, I assume they're very difficult to hit because I'm not actually playing. Another game that shares similarities is Drop Zone 4, and I wasn't able to get any emulation to work with this one, but here's a little bit of footage of the game here. Next is Seawolf, and I think in this one you are a submarine and you're shooting different ships on the surface of the water, trying to avoid those mines that get in your way. Alright, now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 game, which is Air Sea Battle, and it includes all 4 of those different styles of gameplay, starting with the anti-aircraft game here. And this one is very nice, first of all because it's in color, and second of all because you have many more types of aircraft to shoot down. Some of them are larger than others, some of them move faster, sometimes you have helicopters, sometimes you have planes. And then this part of the game is kind of similar to Seawolf, where you're shooting the ships that are going by, trying to hit those mines as well. Actually, the mines just really get in your way more than anything else. And then you have this game here where you're dropping bombs from your aircraft. Kind of reminds me of Drop Zone a little bit. So is Air Sea Battle for the Atari 2600 better than the 4 conglomerated games together? Well, I would definitely say yes. There's a lot more variety, you have color, and of course you can play it at home. That's always a benefit. Next we have one of the greatest arcade games of all time, and that is of course Asteroids. It's a very simple game. All you have to do is avoid all the asteroids and, well, you know, shoot them. Large asteroids turn into medium asteroids turn into small asteroids, and occasionally you have UFOs and satellites that will shoot at you. The original game was made with a vector scan monitor for very high resolution graphics. The downside here is that there's not a lot of color. Also, the controls are extremely, well, complicated. You have to turn left and right with buttons, and thrust with another button, and shoot with another button, and hyperspace with yet another button. So, I don't know, I think Atari was afraid of joysticks. Maybe buttons were just cheaper. They followed up the original Asteroids game with Asteroids Deluxe, which adds a few minor changes, such as having a shield instead of hyperspace, and also these really annoying hexagon-shaped asteroid things that will chase you down if you don't hit all the asteroids in time. So the fact that this game was so big, of course there was going to be an Atari 2600 version of the game. Initially I was a little disappointed because it didn't have the vector graphics of the original. Also, it didn't have nearly as many asteroids on the screen at once, and the asteroids themselves were a little less random. But there is color, which I guess is kind of nice looking back on it. Now, there are so many different variations in this game. There's like 66 different games that you can play. Each one is a little bit different. For example, you can choose to have hyperspace or shields or flip or no special advantage at all. You can also change the speed of the asteroids or how complicated the trajectories are of them, so it makes the game a lot more interesting. So do I think Asteroids for the 2600 is better than the arcade? This is going to be a yes. Sure, you're missing out on the vector graphics, but there's so much more variety and fun embedded in this version of the game than in the original arcade. Plus, you can use a joystick to control your ship. Makes it so much more easy and fun. Next we have Berzerk, which is essentially an early version of Doom, in my opinion. You're basically just wandering around a maze, shooting at enemy robots, and trying to escape to the next room. Avoiding the enemy shots can be challenging sometimes. I always get really nervous when the red robots appear on the screen because now I have to really be cautious. But to be honest, they're really not that smart. A lot of times they'll just shoot at each other or walk into a wall or something. Naturally, you have to be pretty quick in order to avoid the evil auto, because if you wait too long, he'll show up and bounce you right into oblivion. And if you don't shoot all the robots in the stage, the robotic announcer will call you a chicken and that you should fight like a robot.
Intruder alert, intruder alert.
Which is pretty cool that this game has voice.
Chicken, fight like a robot.
That wasn't a very common thing back in the day. A simple game, but very fun. Now let's look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it's even more simple than the original arcade. It does look similar to the arcade, but the mazes are much smaller and far less complicated. One thing you'll notice is that the robots do not shoot diagonally, which makes the game just a little less challenging. Now there's a few game variations here. We have games that include Evil Auto, some that don't include Evil Auto, some where the robots are faster and more challenging, and some variations where you can get extra life. One thing you'll definitely notice that's missing is the voice. There is a new version of the game called Berzerk Enhanced, which includes diagonally shooting robots and voice, which is kind of cool. However, if I had to choose between the arcade and the Atari 2600 game, I'm going to say the arcade version wins out pretty much every time. Alright, here's Breakout, which is a game that is slightly famous because Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak helped make the game. Of course, the story goes that Jobs was working at Atari at the time, and he told his buddy Wozniak that he'd give him $50 if he helped him reduce the number of chips on this game. Of course, he didn't tell him that he was going to get $500 or something like that. It was kind of a one-sided deal. But the game is very simple. All you do is hit the ball and try to knock out all the bricks. Depending on how the ball hits the paddle, it could cause the ball to careen off in a different direction. I mean, think about it. Without the ball changing its angle every so often, it would get pretty boring, wouldn't it? Then here's the Atari 2600 version of the game, and as you can see, it's more presented in a widescreen style than the arcade is. I gotta say, the paddles on the 2600 are very smooth and easy to use. There's also a couple of variations in this version. You have your standard Breakout game, you also have a timed Breakout, and then you have a breakthrough version of the game where the ball just travels straight through the bricks, which, honestly, I can't really understand the point there. There's also variations of the game where you can steer the ball, or catch it, or where the bricks go invisible, so there's a lot of variety in this game too. So is the 2600 version of Breakout better than the arcade? I would say most definitely yes. There's so much more variety in the home port, it really makes it worthwhile to own this version of the game. Here we have Burgertime. Now, of course, I've talked about this game so many times lately. I don't know, I just love this game. It's kind of an interesting concept where you have to walk across burger buns and patties and lettuce to create the perfect burger, all while being chased by hot dogs and eggs and pickles. If you time it just right, you can drop a component on one of the enemies, or if they follow you onto a component and you drop it, then they'll fall down a little bit further. That's what I always try to do. And you can defend yourself by using peppers or just avoiding their really wacky AI. They never go in the way that you expect them to. There's several different stages, each more complicated and difficult than the last. The music is fun and appropriate for the game, and the controls are fantastic. What's not to like? Well, I guess maybe the hunger I feel after playing this game, because I always want a burger. Now, the 2600 version is quite a step down. I mean, a significant step down. First of all, your character, Peter Pepper, walks much slower than in the arcade. The components of the burger don't look anything like they do after they hit the ground. I mean, I don't know if that's a bun, or a piece of cheese, or lettuce, or anything like that. Also, the enemies, aside from the hot dog, don't look anything like the arcade counterparts. I think that may be a french fry bouncing around there. That's nothing like in the arcade. But you still have the pepper, and you can still, drop the components on them, or drop them with the components, either way. There's an attempt at recreating the Burgertime theme. I mean, it's not great, but it's, you know, something. So believe it or not, I really don't feel like the 2600 version is all that terrible. At least it plays very similar to the arcade game. It just doesn't look much like it, and it's also much slower than the original arcade. But for sure, the original arcade is significantly better than this version. Next we have a game called Cannonball, and I don't think this game was actually ever created. It's just a prototype, and essentially what you're supposed to do here is shoot a person so that they will go through this, I guess, this hole in the wall right here. You can see the graphics are really chewed up and everything. But yeah, this was just a prototype game that was never completed. But there is an Atari 2600 version of this game called Human Cannonball. And essentially what you do here is you try to get the right speed and angle to shoot a human being, as strange as that sounds, out of the cannon and into this, I guess this is a water tower you're trying to get him into. And if you do it just right, he'll land in there and give you the thumbs up. Otherwise, you either shoot too far and he goes flying, or you crash him into the side of the water tower. Also, there's a few variations in the game. You have this wall that kind of appears and you have to shoot through the wall, making it even more difficult than just trying to get the guy on the water tower. So just by virtue of this game being complete and playable, the 2600 version is definitely better. It's not fun, but it's definitely better. Here we have Canyon Bomber, and in this game your job is to drop bombs into this canyon and try to clear it out. You're allowed to shoot as many bombs as you want until you start to miss, and that will reduce your number of tries. So you do have to plan when you're going to drop your bombs, just a little bit, so to make sure that you hit something. And as you can see, each rock has a different point value. You got 1s and 2s and 3s. And I always thought it was kind of cool how when you hit some of the boulders that they all kind of collapse into each other. Now, the Atari 2600 version of this game, I believe, was created by David Crane, and is a little bit nicer because it's in color, and naturally you've got a lot more variations in the game. You can play as helicopters or planes, and there's also different variations in the game. For example, you can play variations where the components of the canyon collapse into each other, or other ones where they just kind of float in midair, which is kind of weird. There's also what appears to be a version of Destroyer. This one definitely looks more like Destroyer from the arcade. If only I had figured out how to use that yellow line to drop the bombs, I think that would have been more fun. But again, I think this is a case where the 2600 version of the game is better because, you know, there's way more variations, there's color, there's actually a different game that's included, and this one's also 2-player, so that's an added bonus. Here we have a game called Circus, and in this game you are, well, I guess a clown that's bouncing up and down, trying to hit these balloons, along with his friend who is on a seesaw, who is hopefully going to catch you when you come back down again. And then he bounces up into the air and hits some balloons, and you try to catch him, and it just goes back and forth over and over again until you hit all the balloons. A pretty simple Breakout variant with a neat premise. Now here's Circus Atari, which is a very similar game. You're still bouncing up and down on a seesaw with a clown friend of yours, trying to hit all the balloons up in the ceiling. I noticed that the balloons are much faster here. Also, this one controls with the paddle controller, which is very nice and easy to use. If you press the button, you can switch the position of your character on the teeter-totter. It makes it a little bit easier to catch your friend who's bouncing down. And that's something that's not in the arcade version. Also, we have numerous game variations. Sometimes there's barriers on the screen to block you from hitting the balloons. Other games allow you to just break through all the balloons, making it a little bit easier than the regular game. It's a pretty simple game, but it's still a lot of fun. And because of all the different variations and gameplay elements, and plus the fact that you can flip your teeter-totter around to catch your friend, I'm going to say that the Atari version is way better than the arcade game. Okay, here's Defender, which is one of the classic arcade games of all time from Williams Electronics. The goal here is to rescue the humanoids who are, just minding their own business, wandering around on the moon, while these aliens come along and capture them and try to turn them into mutants. There's a radar at the top of the screen to kind of give you an idea of where all the enemies are. The biggest problem with the original arcade game, though, are the controls. You have an up and down joystick to move your ship, you have a button to reverse your ship's direction, you have a button to thrust, you have another button to shoot, and you have another button for the hyperspace. Oh, and another button for the smart bombs. It's a very complicated game to play, and anybody who masters it has definitely gained my respect. Now, the 2600 game is quite a bit simpler than the original arcade game, naturally. First of all, you use the joystick to maneuver your ship up and down, and also left and right will change direction and thrust. In order to do a hyperspace, you have to move your ship to the top of the screen and actually off the screen, which kind of defeats the purpose of the hyperspace because you have to do it really quickly usually. And then to do a smart bomb, you have to hide behind the city here and then hit the button. Both instances, you're invulnerable from the enemies, so it's quite a bit easier than the arcade. But hey, it's still pretty cool that we've got the radar screen up above there. Another limitation is that if you catch a humanoid, then your other humanoids won't be kidnapped. Makes the game quite a bit easier. So between the two, I'm going to say that the arcade game is quite a bit better than the Atari 2600 version. Not to say that the 2600 game isn't good, it's just not as good as the arcade. I did really enjoy this game when I was a kid. It's significantly easier than the original. Okay, here's Dodge 'em, and this is a very simple game. Basically, the goal here is to, eat up all the dots and avoid the enemy car who's trying to crash into you for some strange reason. And you can speed up your car by pushing the button, and you can change rows by moving the joystick left and right. In order to move 2 rows, you have to let off on the button though. Pretty simple game, but very frustrating. The 2600 game is very similar, although it's a little pared down. You still drive a car, trying to avoid the other car, moving as fast as you can to collect all these dots. And if you push on the button, you speed up. If you let off on the button, you can travel different lanes, 2 lanes at a time. And it's basically just a test to see how long you can play without getting frustrated. I've never really enjoyed this game, to be honest. Now, the Atari version only has 3 different game variations. There's a 1-player mode, and then there's a couple of 2-player modes. So which one is better? I mean, I guess the 2600 version is just better by virtue of its color and the fact that it has a couple of different play modes in there. Neither of these games are really that good. Alright, here we have Donkey Kong, the classic first game that Mario appeared in. And before you tell me that his name is Jumpman, yes, I know. However, Nintendo has retconned the character of Mario to be in Donkey Kong. So you can say Jumpman or you can say Mario. Either one works. In this game, your goal is to save your girlfriend, whose name is Pauline. Whatever happened to Pauline, she pretty much disappeared after this game. In the first stage, you have to jump over the barrels, and you can crush them with a hammer. In the second stage, you have to get all the rivets and cause Donkey Kong to come crashing down to the bottom. In the third stage, you have to avoid these springs and climb up to the top of this very broken up looking stage. And in the fourth stage, you have to avoid more of those foxfires on the cement factory stage. So of course there are 4 stages in the arcade game, but there's only 2 in the Atari 2600 game. One thing that programmer Gary Kitchen was adamant about was making sure that the platforms were slanted. That makes the game feel a little bit more like the arcade, and it's actually a pretty cool achievement to see the barrels rolling down those slanted platforms like that. The second stage is a little bit of a disappointment because the foxfires don't move up and down. They only move left and right, which can be very challenging to get those rivets out of there. So clearly the arcade game of Donkey Kong is going to be better than the Atari 2600 just by virtue of the fact that it has all 4 screens and the behavior of the enemies is a little bit more fleshed out. That's not to say that Donkey Kong on the 2600 is a bad game, it's just not as good as the arcade. Next is a game called Drag Race, where you are, well, I guess supposed to race another car as quickly as you can. Basically, you hit the gas pedal and shift gears and try to avoid, well, losing, I guess. I've never really been a big fan of this game, and I really don't know what the heck I'm doing in order to shift gears. My favorite part, though, is when the car does a wheelie. Alright, the Atari 2600 version of the game was called Dragster, and it's from Activision. It's essentially the same game where you have to hit the gas pedal at the right time and shift gears in order to keep the car moving as fast as possible. I have never quite gotten the hang of this game, and my fastest time here was 671, which I guess is pretty slow. I'm not even sure. There's not a whole heck of a lot to this game, it's pretty simple. And honestly, I really don't care for either of them that much, but I think the 2600 game is better, mostly because the size of the car is ginormous. And of course, you can just play it as many times as you want. Next is Frogger, the classic arcade game where you jump a frog across the road and then across the, well, I guess, it must be a polluted river because don't frogs know how to swim? Anyway, you have to get them to one of 5 homes across the top of the screen, and you can collect lady frogs for bonus points or eat the fly. Also, the music in the game is iconic, and a lot of the later versions do not include it, which is a shame. And the reason for that is because it is a Japanese nursery song, and I believe it was copyrighted, so future versions of the game can't include it. And here is the Atari 2600 version from Parker Brothers. The gameplay is essentially the same, which is, it's okay. I've never really cared for the way that the frog jumps. It's just like an instant, almost like a teleport. Also, the graphics are just slightly less detailed than the arcade version, but at least it tries to do the music in between stages. So between the arcade and the Parker Brothers version, yeah, I mean, the arcade is going to be way better. However, there is actually another version of Frogger for the 2600 that was on tape for the Starpath Arcadia Supercharger, whatever you want to call it. And this version is incredible. The music is played during the game, your frog has much better animation, there's a lot more details in the graphics themselves. So if you had to pick a 2600 version of this game, definitely go with the Supercharger version. However, if I had to pick between the arcade and the Supercharger version of Frogger, I'm still gonna go with the arcade. Next here's Gorf, which I've always thought was a little interesting because it's more or less a collection of mini-games. You've got your Space Invaders clone here, you've got a Galaga-style game here with laser attack, and then you have a more proper Galaxians attack. Then you have something called Space Warp, which, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of Gyrus a little bit. And then finally you have one of the earliest boss battles that I can remember, where you have to defeat this flagship. One of the unique things about Gorf, other than the fact that it has multiple stages, is that your ship can move up and down, and if you were to fire and miss, you can press the fire button again to basically abort that missed shot. And if you're very clever, you can actually use this to your advantage, especially in like the Galaxian stages or even the laser attack stages, because as those enemies get closer to you, all you have to do is just keep hitting the button over and over again, and there's no way they can avoid your shot. Alright, how about the Atari 2600 version? Can it keep up with the arcade? Well, no, not at all. We do have a Space Invaders stage here. And here's the laser attack stage. Next is the Space Warp stage. Unfortunately, it's missing the actual warping part. And then finally we have the flagship, which, oof, man, it's a pretty weak excuse for a flagship if you ask me. Something that's definitely missing is the shield that will either protect your ship or the flagship. So basically, Gorf on the 2600 cannot hold a candle to the original arcade game. I'll give them some credit for making a valiant effort, but there's really no way that you could do a decent version of Gorf on the Atari 2600. Well, unless you're a homebrewer. Our next game is Gunfight. I think this is a 2-player only game because I couldn't find any computer-controlled opponents here. Now this game had a rather unique control method. You actually have 2 joysticks. One of them is to move your cowboy around, and the other is to move your gun position. So could we consider this game to be the world's first twin-stick shooter? Now the game starts off pretty easy, there's not a whole lot of obstacles, but as you progress, more and more things will get in your way between you and your enemy cowboy. For example, you have this covered wagon getting in your way. I like how you can bounce your gunshots off the bottom of the screen. The Atari 2600 game is called Outlaw, and it's essentially the same, except with much blockier graphics. There's also a lot more variety in this version of the game. For example, you may have a cactus blocking your way, or that covered wagon that's just kind of sitting there. You can also shoot at targets that are just moving up and down. So I'm going to say that the 2600 version of Outlaw is better than the arcade version of Gunfight. Again, mostly because there's a lot of variety in the 2600 game that just is not there in the original arcade. Alright, here's a doozy. Missile Command. In this game, you use a trackball to aim your pointer around the screen and shoot missiles from 3 different bases to protect your cities from incoming ICBMs. The control in this game is super smooth and fast thanks to the trackball. Also, having 3 bases on the screen adds to the strategy of the game because the missiles from the base in the middle are very fast, whereas the missiles from the left and right bases are a little bit slower. Then we have the 2600 version of the game, and it's a little bit simpler, but overall this version is really good. The first thing you're going to notice is that there's only 1 base to shoot your missiles from, which actually I kind of like that because it's easier to just point and shoot versus having to remember which base you want to shoot your missiles from. One downside though is that you have to use the joystick to control your pointer, and it's not going to be as fast or as smooth as using a trackball. Now there are hacks for the game that allow you to use a trackball, but of course we're talking about the original version of the game. Another downside of this version is that there's only a limited number of directions that your incoming missiles are going to come from. That makes it just a little bit easier and unfortunately a little less interesting to look at. Oh, and you can only have 3 missiles exploding on the screen at once. So that kind of limits your abilities just a little bit. But the upside is that there's a lot of different play modes in the game, and you can skip ahead in the stages as far as you want. I recommend you play game 13 and just let it run. Just see what happens. So was the Atari 2600 version able to exceed the original arcade game? I would say in some ways yes. There's many more gameplay modes, and it is just slightly easier than the arcade, but overall I have a hard time saying that the 2600 game is better. Here's Mousetrap, and basically this is a Pac-Man clone where you wander around a maze eating cheese, opening doors, avoiding cats, turning into a dog and attacking the cats. Hopefully you're not eating the cats, I'm not really sure about that one. If you go into that in part in the center of the screen, you'll be teleported to some random corner of the maze. To open one of the doors, you have 3 different buttons to press, either the red, yellow, or blue buttons. And I find it hilarious that there's a spot in the game where you can kind of be safe from the cats, although you can still get the bird. My favorite part though is when you turn into the dog. So here's the 2600 version of the game, which is very stripped down from the arcade. You can still turn into the dog and attack the cats. So you still have to eat all the cheese, but unfortunately they just look like dashes. One of the big limitations of this game is that the Atari joystick only has 1 button, which means you have to use it for opening the doors and also for turning into the dog. If you hold the button down, you'll open or shut a trapdoor, but if you push the button quickly, you'll change into a dog. Yeah, so there's really no way that the 2600 version is going to be better than the arcade. I mean, it's not even a graphics thing, it's just the fact that you only have 1 button to work with. It might have been better if they'd used the difficulty switches and or the black and white switch to open and shut the doors. Next we have Mr. Do, where you are a clown, and you're digging through the dirt for some reason, much like Dig Dug. You have to collect all the cherries, and avoid the enemies, and avoid getting crushed by the apples. What I like about this game is that the enemies don't phase through the dirt like they do in Dig Dug. Also, you have a weapon that you can shoot at the enemies, or you know, you can also crush them with the apples, much like you can crush the enemies in Dig Dug with rocks. This is one of those forgotten classic arcade games, in my opinion. Alright, let's take a look at the 2600 version, and oh my god. This is rough. There's no in-game music. There's only a couple enemies that appear on the screen. The resolution of the game is so low that you really can't strategize digging through the ground like you can in the arcade. But I mean, hey, at least you can still shoot. So yeah, this isn't much of a contest. The 2600 version of this game definitely did not live up to the promise of the original arcade. Okay, here's Night Driver, and this is a very simple game. All you have to do is drive down the dark road and not crash on the sides. This game is a little challenging to play with an emulator. I couldn't figure out how to get the mouse to work, so I was actually using my Xbox 360 controller, which is why I'm darting all over the road here. The original arcade actually has a steering wheel and an accelerator, and it also has a high and a low gear, so if you want to crash even faster than normal, you know, put it in high gear. Now this is a perfect game to translate to the Atari 2600 because of the minimalist graphics. There's a couple of improvements to the arcade here. You've got some objects on the side of the road to look at, like trees and houses. Also, occasionally you have to avoid a car in the middle of the road, something I don't recall seeing in the arcade game. There's also Novice, Pro, and Expert difficulties. Also, the 2600 game replicates the arcade steering wheel pretty nicely by using the paddle controllers. So yeah, I'm gonna give it to the 2600 this time. I think it's a nice improvement over the arcade in terms of color and playability and stuff to look at. Okay, this is the one you've been waiting for, Pac-Man. The original arcade game has you playing as a yellow pizza, chasing down monsters covered in sheets. All you have to do is eat all the dots, avoid the monsters, and eat the power pellet to eat the monsters. One thing I do like about this game is that each of the monsters have their own different personalities. So some of them will chase directly after you, others will try to cut you off, some of them just kind of wander around aimlessly. So that adds a little bit of a strategy element to the game. Now here's the 2600 game, and of course, as you can tell, it looks nothing like the arcade game. Not only that, the ghosts don't really have much intelligence to them. I think they're just drawn to your position in the maze. Not to mention the fact that they don't run away when you eat a power pellet. So the 2600 game is not a really good conversion of the original arcade game, but overall it's not a bad game in and of itself. But naturally the arcade game just walks all over this one. Alright, next we have the grandfather of all video games, Pong, and it's one of the most simple games ever. All you have to do is avoid missing the ball for the high score. In fact, I think that's all the instructions you get on the actual arcade machine. The controls are very simple. All you have is a paddle controller for you and your opponent. Now I say opponent because this is a two-player only game. If you don't have anybody to play with like me, you end up playing by yourself, which is not really fun. And a lot more difficult to play, let me add. Now here we have Video Olympics for the Atari 2600. It has a version of Pong included, and what's nice about this version of the game is that it is a single-player game, so you don't need a friend to play. That in and of itself is enough to make this version of the game better than the arcade, but Video Olympics also includes many more varieties of Pong, which is kind of crazy. You've also got Super Pong, Soccer, Foospong, Hockey, Quadra-Pong, Handball, Volleyball, and Basketball. Naturally, all of these games are just kind of varieties of the same thing, just, you know, more paddles or different orientations of the paddles and things like that. But it's pretty clear to me that Video Olympics for the 2600 is much better than just the original Pong arcade game by itself. I mean, even the Pong that's included in Video Olympics is better than the arcade game. Next we have Popeye, and in this game you play as the titular character who is going around collecting objects from olive oil, either hearts or notes or letters. All the while you're being chased by Bluto and attacked by the Sea Witch who's throwing bottles at you. You can turn the tables on Bluto by eating spinach and knocking him out. Or in stage 1, you can drop a barrel on his head, which is kind of my favorite thing to do. There's 3 different stages. You have this first stage where you're collecting hearts, and then the second stage you're collecting musical notes. And then the third stage, you're on a ship collecting different letters. Alright, so the Atari 2600 version does an admirable effort of trying to replicate the arcade. You still have Bluto chasing you around these stages. You still have to collect the hearts. It even has music, which is pretty nice. The first stage layout is pretty accurate to the arcade, but the second stage is not at all like the arcade. I'm sure they had to mirror the screen like this due to the memory constraints of the 2600. And here's the ship stage. It looks pretty good, although you're only collecting X's here, you're not collecting different letters. So the 2600 game is not awful, it's not terrible, but it's definitely not as good as the original arcade. Here's Q*bert, a game where you jump on cubes and change their colors and avoid enemies, like this giant snake who's chasing after me. Later stages you have to jump on the cubes twice in order to change their colors, or sometimes you'll get enemies that will change the color for you and you have to go and change it back. But the goal is to make all the cubes the same color. Clearly the graphics in the 2600 game are not as good. There's not as many cubes to jump on, so it's a little bit easier in that regard. But Q*bert moves pretty fast, and it even has a little bit of music in between stages, so that's pretty nice. So while the 2600 game is fun, it's definitely not as good as the original arcade. And next we have Rampage, which is a very highly detailed game where you play as a monster smashing buildings and eating people and destroying helicopters. Sometimes stuff will appear out of the side of the building after you smash it, like, there'll be people sitting in bathtubs, or you might find a chicken or something to eat. Or you could find some poison, or, you might punch, like, an electrical sign or something like that and shock yourself. You're not invincible, though. Over time, you'll take damage, and eventually you'll turn back into a human and slink away in total shame. It's a fun game for a while, but it does get pretty monotonous. As for the 2600 version, honestly, I can't believe they actually tried this. You actually get to pick from 3 different characters, though. That's pretty interesting. Again, you just kind of smash the buildings, but the limited graphics of the 2600 means you really have to use your imagination. I do find it interesting, though, that there's helicopters flying around in the background. Obviously, this is a very limited version of Rampage, and in no way, shape, or form is it better than the arcade. Next we have the phenomenon that's known as Space Invaders. A very simple game. All you do is shoot at the invading aliens, but you have to drink a bottle of Shasta and play your All Rush mixtape in order to win.
Let's rock.
The original game did not feature any color whatsoever. The only way you get color is by having these overlays on the screen. So what you're seeing here is actually simulated color from the emulator. As you shoot the aliens, they get a little bit faster as they move back and forth. Sometimes a UFO flies across the top of the screen in order to break up the action. I mean, really, it'd be pretty boring if all you were doing was shooting these aliens. Now here's the Atari 2600 version, and this is really the game that launched the 2600. Without Space Invaders, I don't think we would be talking about Atari today. Now, this game was created by Rick Maurer, and I don't think he gets enough credit for how awesome this game is. There's 112 different variations, which is mind-blowing. You know, variations where the missiles zigzag, or the aliens are invisible, or your bases move back and forth, or sometimes you don't even have any bases. There's even two-player variations where you can have two cannons on screen at once, or your friend can be the firing while you do the moving. It's really an incredible conversion of the game. Now, there's not as many aliens on the screen as in the arcade, but the fact that you have as many as there are is pretty incredible. All this adds up to a game that totally surpasses the original arcade game. On a side note, I really don't understand why, when Space Invaders is included in a collection of Atari games, that this version is not part of it. There's like a homebrew or a hack or something that makes the game look like the original, and to be perfectly honest, I'd much rather play this version of the game. So Atari, please stop including that other version. Include this one instead. Here's Space War, which, if I'm not mistaken, started out life as a MIT mainframe game. Now, this version is called Space Wars, and it's by Cinematronics. And I'm pretty sure it is a two-player game because I couldn't get the opposing ship to do anything. But it's pretty simple. You just fly around in space and shoot your enemies, all while avoiding the sun in the middle of the screen there. Now, the first game that Nolan Bushnell created was called Computer Space, and it was basically the same as this one, but it was not very successful. So I guess you could say this is the first arcade video game, even before Pong. So here's the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it's basically like combat in outer space. You control a spaceship, and your friend controls a spaceship, and you try to shoot each other. There's variations where you can bounce off the side of the screen, or pass through the screen, or sometimes the sun will be in the middle of the screen to avoid. And there's also a space shuttle game where you have to dock with the space module in order to score. So it's pretty safe to say that the Atari 2600 game is better than the original arcade game. Again, there's just so much more included in the home version. Next we have Tank, or in this case, Ultra Tank, and as you can see, this is the game that inspired Combat. It was created by Key Games, which was a subsidiary of Atari, but in the game you control a tank and your friend controls a tank and you just try to shoot each other. You can also control the bullets, which is cool, but when you shoot your enemy, he doesn't go flying across the screen, which makes it, I don't know, a little bit less challenging than the home version. So speaking of the home version, here is Combat for the Atari 2600. Of course, you have the Tanks game, just like the arcade Tank game, only better. Well, I say better, but unfortunately this game is only single player. But there's a lot of different variations to the Tank game where you can have different layouts. You can have the bullets that bounce off the walls. You can have invisible tanks. You can have invisible walls. Just the Tanks game alone will keep you entertained as long as you have a friend with you. But there's actually two other types of games included here too. You've got the biplanes and you've got the jets. And there's some variations in the aircraft games too, like sometimes you have multiple jets, or you'll have clouds, or sometimes you won't have clouds. So I would say Combat for the 2600 is definitely an improvement over Tank and Ultra Tank. Here's Up and Down, a game where you drive a car down and up. Wait, scratch that, reverse it. Basically, you just drive your little Volkswagen Beetle and try to collect the flags while avoiding these enemy cars. You can jump on top of the cars, but if you're careful, you might jump off the road, which can be frustrating sometimes. But if you time it just right, you can actually jump to the other side of the road, which is kind of cool. There's even a little bit of pseudo 3D in the graphics. Now here's the 2600 version, and ugh. The graphics are pretty rough. It's kind of hard to see what's going on here. Also, the music is terrible. It's hurting my ears. I don't know who was clamoring for a home port of this game, but this one just doesn't really do it for me. It's an admirable effort, but there's really no way that the 2600 game is going to be better than the arcade. Next is a game that I consider to be probably the best party arcade game ever made, and that's Warlords. It's kind of like a 4-player Breakout, where you must protect your castle and king from being destroyed, all while trying to destroy the enemy castles and kings. You control the shield that protects your castle from the fireballs, which you can either grab or bounce off your shield. And if the fireball hits your king, well, that's game over for you. If you happen to destroy one of the enemy warlords, then a fireball will pop out, making the game even more challenging. Here we have the Atari 2600 version, and the way I understand it, this version and the arcade version were in development at the same time. But the 2600 game was released first, with the arcade game coming out sometime later. So this may be the first case where the home version was released in advance of the arcade game. But as you can see, the game is very similar to the arcade. You still have to protect your king and your castle from being destroyed by bouncing the fireball off your shield. Both games have buttery smooth controls because they use the paddle controller. However, the 2600 game only has one fireball that appears on the screen. Also, it's a best of 5 match, which makes the game a little bit more interesting. And what I really like about it is that you can play by yourself against 3 computer-controlled opponents. Despite the fact that the 2600 only has one fireball on the screen and it has lesser graphics, I'm still going to say that this version is an improvement over the arcade. And finally we have Zaxxon, the pseudo 3D shooter where you fly a plane into some kind of enemy base and you have to avoid missiles and shields and laser beams and rockets and other kinds of spaceships and stuff like that. The only way that you can get through some of these shields is to continually fire and wait to see if your missile will shoot right through it or not. If it does, you know you're at the right altitude. And then once you get to the end of the stage, you have a robot to battle. You gotta shoot that missile that's right there in the side of the robot. It's funny, I just remember how back in the day people were so in love with this game because of the 3D-esque graphics. I mean, none of us had ever seen anything like this before. So naturally there was a lot of home ports of the game, and probably the least of all was the 2600 version. I remember the first time I played this version, I just couldn't believe how awful it was. It really didn't look anything like the arcade at all. Instead of having the 3/4 perspective view, you have a straight-on view of the game, which is not the way I wanted to play Zaxxon. However, if you can get over that deficiency, the game isn't all that bad. You still have to maneuver your plane through this treacherous base, and then shoot the enemy robot there at the end. So yeah, there's really no way that the 2600 version is better than the arcade here. Truthfully, it's not a terrible game, it's just not nearly as good as the arcade. Maybe if somebody hacked Desert Falcon into Zaxxon, we'd have the proper version of the game that we all deserved. Alright, there you go. 30 arcade to Atari 2600 home ports. Some of them good, some of them bad, and some of them where the Atari version outshines the arcade. Which arcade to 2600 port do you feel is better than the arcade? Please let me know down in the comments. Until then, I want to thank you for watching, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye everyone.